I was inspired by an advisor, Jacob Harold, who had been the CEO of GuideStar and then co-founder of Candid, who's doing a bunch of really amazing work looking at the novel models for nonprofit governance. And he encouraged me to consider this as a time-limited project. And it just made sense to me immediately because what I'm really interested in is being a catalytic force in this space, not creating an organization that has to live on forever. Now, the technology that we build, we will eventually donate that into a nonprofit, hopefully a top-tier nonprofit that can give it the care and feeding that it needs indefinitely. But we will exist to build this resource and to gain momentum around this resource and then contribute it into another organization to hold.
This is Associations Thrive, the podcast celebrating successful associations and their leaders. I'm your host, Joanna Pineda, CEO and Chief Troublemaker at Matrix Group International. Listen in as top association executives tell all, revealing the creative and innovative ways they're increasing membership, generating revenue, nurturing engagement, and reimagining their organizations. By the way, if you've launched a new initiative, created new member services, or updated your governance structure and are seeing great results, I want to hear your story, and so do my listeners. I'd love to have you as a guest. Go to podcast.matrixgroup.net and apply to be on Associations Thrive. Now let's dive into this week's show. Today, I'm speaking with Patrick Smith, founder and executive director at Soil Upside. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Joanna, thanks.
Patrick, tell us about Soil Upside.
Soil Upside is an organization that's building a database of incentives, economic incentives, to help farmers switch to climate-smart agriculture. There's a huge movement here in the last 10 years to encourage growers to move into climate-smart ag, which is also called regenerative agriculture, which has an impact on all of the major crises that we're facing as a species, whether that's carbon or biodiversity or water, really significant impact that working lands can make on those.
So Patrick, your organization is called Soil Upside. What does soil have to do with climate, and what is climate-smart agriculture? I'm not familiar with the term.
Climate-smart ag is a movement to move away from just chemically focused agriculture into biologically-centric agriculture. So it's meant to stimulate the microbiology of the soil. That has profound effects in terms of mitigating topsoil loss, encouraging biodiversity increase in soil and above ground, water infiltration rates, carbon sequestration. The entire ecosystem is restored as soil health is improved.
Patrick, your website says that in the United States, only 5% of agricultural land is in transition. I didn't know what that meant. What does that mean?
That means in transition from conventional agriculture, chemically intensive agriculture, and just intensive management practices like tillage, into climate smart or regenerative agriculture. This is a really difficult transition for farmers and ranchers. Once the transition is made, it's more profitable and there's lots of economic benefits, both for the grower and their community. But that moment of transition, the first 2 or 3 years of that transition, is really difficult for growers to get across because there's investments that need to be made, because there's learning curve, because the soil biology is adapting to new management practices, and there's funding that's necessary for that transition period, which is what we're focused on.
And so you're building a database that will help me, Joanna the farmer, find this funding so that I can make this transition.
Yeah, there's massive amounts of funding that is going into supporting climate smart agriculture. Just at the federal level, over $23 billion was allocated for investment in transitioning to climate smart ag in the Inflation Reduction Act. $3 billion of that through a new program called the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, and then $20 billion additional dollars to flow through the standard USDA programs like the Natural Resources Conservation Service and some of their incentive and grant cost share programs. That's just at the federal level. Then you have state level, you have water districts, you have philanthropic grants and cost shares. Then you have new markets that are developing for more nutritional dense foods, for foods with lower carbon intensity. And then you have a whole nother category where major corporations are paying to reduce the carbon footprint in their supply chains. And many companies, food and fashion companies that are dependent on ag have up to, if not more than 70% of their emissions come from their supply chains. So all of these things are combining to create a really significant focus on incentivizing farmers to change. But for you, Joanna, as the farmer, that creates a really confusing landscape. You're trying to figure out man, just applying for one federal grant is really confusing. Not to mention you have folks that are trying to buy carbon credits from you approaching you. You have big food brands that are trying to figure this out. You have a bunch of conversations that are happening among your neighbors, and it's brand new. So what we're trying to do is bring sense to that set of economic incentives so that farmers can find the ones that are most appropriate to their crop and their region and their management practices. One important note here, a similar database has existed in the renewable energy space for probably 30, 35 years. It's called DESIRE, the Database of Sustainable Incentives for Renewable Energy, I think is what it stands for. And that's been critical infrastructure for the renewable energy space for participants throughout the supply chain, whether that's you or me as homeowners or business owners or solar project developers or commercial property owners, to try to figure out what incentives are available to switch to renewable energy. This is a similar infrastructure that we're trying to build for farmers to switch to climate smart agriculture.
Wow, that was a mouthful. We're going to get into what Soil Upside is doing in a second. But before we do that, Patrick, we got to talk about your journey. You and I have known each other a long time. And I was actually talking to my husband about this. And I think I met you in 1999 when you were at Adrenaline.
Yep, the Adrenaline Group.
So that was in 99. I interviewed for a job there. And then I ended up starting Matrix Group. Do you remember that? I was going to be like VP of Biz Dev or something. And then I ended up starting Matrix Group. And then we ran into each other later on because you were co-founder of Market Hardware.
Yep.
Which was a website marketplace, right? Where small businesses could create template websites for not very much money, but you were in specific verticals. And then you started Catalyst Meals, which became Territory Foods, and now Soil Upside. So I don't even know where to begin. Tell us about the entrepreneurial journey, I guess. What's been important?
Curiosity has been important. That's the big thing for me.
Well, so how do you go from Catalyst Meals to Soil Upside, for example? Because I think there's a connection there.
Yeah, there very much is. So when I was building Catalyst, which became Territory Foods, that was focused on food as medicine. And you can't really be living at that intersection of food and health for too long before you start to think about where it was grown. And many of our clients, for example, were very interested in grass-fed beef or organic produce with good reason, because you tend to think if you're trying to eat for your health, you don't want it to be grown with chemicals. So that led me to, after I transitioned out of Territory and with a couple stops in there, but where I was led is to work on climate. And as I investigated very specific opportunities in climate, I realized, man, my experience in food leads directly to this agricultural impact. And it gave me an understanding for what some of the dynamics in the food supply chain are. Agriculture in the US, it's more globally, but in the US, agriculture accounts for 10% of our carbon footprint. And that can be reduced to net zero by 2040 if we implement climate smart ag. So it was understanding that, but then also understanding how much interest there was among farmers. Those two things combined to send me on this path that I've been now working in regenerative agriculture for the last 3.5 years.
But you're going from a couple of for-profit companies, one of them venture-backed, to a nonprofit organization devoted to soil health.
Yep.
What's that transition been like?
It's a long and windy transition, but really wonderful. So I actually was running a venture studio focused on regenerative ag for over 2 years with some amazing partners and looking at all sorts of different opportunities inside Regen. But what I was doing mostly was looking for like root cause analysis. And when I looked at what the levers are to change the system, it kept coming back to economics.
Of course.
Right. I mean, that's what drives the system generally. And in Regen in particular, it's fascinating because it's more profitable for farmers after they transition. There's less expenses on synthetic inputs, for example. Their crops are more productive and they're more consistently productive across extreme weather events. So there's lots of reasons why it's more profitable in the long term. But I came to realize that it's this moment of transition when that is the main lever in all of this, and that the right vehicle to encourage that is not a for-profit. It's a nonprofit, because the data around these incentives needs to live in the public domain. It belongs in the commons so that everybody can access this data and put it to the most effective use possible.
Well, let's transition to Soil Upside. How are you funding this whole operation?
Yeah, it's a combination of philanthropic donors, individuals, foundations, and then folks in the supply chain that are motivated to encourage transition among the growers that they work with. Now, I should also note, this is super early. So when I say that's how we're funded, that's the theory of how we are going to be funded. We're in the process of running our initial fundraise. So trying to get essentially a seed round. From the technology point of view, I think of it as a seed round. Trying to get a seed round done in order to get us off the ground.
But Patrick, when we were prepping, you also talked about how you want to run Soil Upside as a fiscally sponsored project. I'm not familiar with this concept, so tell us about this.
For those that are experts, I would assume that many in your audience are. I apologize in advance for my super simplistic explanation here. But fiscally sponsored projects essentially are able to adopt the nonprofit status of their sponsoring organization. The project has to meet certain criteria, including fitting into the mission of the sponsoring organization. And then essentially the sponsoring organization gets restricted grants or restricted donations into that project, and the project is funded that way.
Of course. So what kind of organizations might be funding Soil Upside, and what kind of projects would they be funding?
You're talking about the fiscal sponsors?
The fiscally sponsored projects, yes.
So the fiscally sponsoring organizations, it's a whole industry. What we're looking at is top-tier organizations that have a climate focus, who can provide not just the technical kind of umbrella of operational support, which all fiscal sponsors do, but also value-added support and connections and advice.
And Patrick, you say that you want to run Soil Upside to be a temporary organization.
Yep.
Which really struck me as maybe a little bit radical, because many times, people found organizations and they say, look, I want this to be forever serving the needs of, Alexandria, Virginia. I mean, occasionally I'll meet a CEO who says, really, when our job is done, we're going to shut down this organization, but we know that's going to take some time. So temporary, we're not going to get out of this climate mess for a while.
No, we're not. I was inspired by an advisor, Jacob Harold, who had been the CEO of GuideStar and then co-founder of Candid, who's doing a bunch of really amazing work looking at the novel models for nonprofit governance. And he encouraged me to consider this as a time-limited project. And it just made sense to me immediately, because what I'm really interested in is being a catalytic force in this space, not creating an organization that has to live on forever. Now, the technology that we build, we will eventually donate that into a nonprofit, hopefully a top-tier nonprofit that can give it the care and feeding that it needs indefinitely. But we will exist to build this resource and to gain momentum around this resource, and then contribute it into another organization to hold.
So, Patrick, you're not saying the need will disappear and therefore Soil Upside will no longer be needed, but you're building something that then somebody else can run. But in the meantime, you've got this vision for this database that will really help farmers find the funding to be able to transition.
Yeah, what I would say is that similar to the funding that farmers need, it's the embodiment of activation energy that helps farmers transition. What we're trying to do is also embody that activation energy for the space in aggregating all of this information and building the technology that needs to exist. This is critical infrastructure that has to exist, but it also needs a small and nimble group. It needs a group that has deep technology knowledge. It needs a startup founder, frankly, to get this going. And that's what I am. So that's what I want to do.
Are you essentially the founder of another tech startup with soil upside?
Absolutely. It just happens to be a nonprofit.
So talk to us about the tech that you're building. And is this building from scratch? You're buying, you're licensing?
We're going to be building it from scratch. I mean, with some of the most amazing individuals in the world, developers and advisors. Actually, you know one of them, Kevin DeWalt, who's running ProLego.
Oh, yes, I definitely know Kevin. He's amazing.
Yeah. So a friend, close advisor, is running an AI consultancy that is consulting with Fortune 100 companies on their AI transitions. So conversations with him, my own explorations, conversations with other folks in the space made me realize that this is possible. And essentially what we're doing is scraping, gathering information from the web, all of this unstructured data about all of these different incentive programs, and then using LLMs and other AI technology on the back end to make sense of that, transition it into structured data that then can be accessed through various front ends that we build, whether those are APIs or geospatial interfaces or chat interfaces.
Wow. So you're infusing the technology with AI right from the beginning and probably just zooming along in your development and data gathering.
It couldn't happen without the AI tools that exist now.
So this was the right organization at the right time.
Hopefully, yeah.
Patrick, what's a normal day like for you? New nonprofit, building software, trying to raise money. What's it like?
You know, it's interesting. One of my favorite phrases is the capitalist exploits the worker, but the entrepreneur exploits themselves.
Oh,
and
it's so true.
I think that's also true for nonprofits. So one thing that you and I haven't talked about is that right after I graduated from undergrad, I was a social worker for 3 years.
Man, I did not know this about you.
So I have a penchant to giving myself to the mission. I think that's one of the reasons why startups are really attractive to me. But there's a danger of exploiting yourself in that for the mission. And so as I get older, one of the things that I'm really committed to is trying to maintain balance in my life and invest in my own personal health and wellness. So for example, this morning I was up at 6, went to the gym, back at the desk by 9, have been on calls and doing work, writing. And to me, that is an ideal day when I can mix the creative expression with relational investment, with physicality. And I love that. End the week with sauna and cold plunge.
So are you running this nonprofit differently so that you don't exploit yourself too much?
I'm trying to. Yeah.
Patrick, you're a new nonprofit with this great mission. How are you getting the word out, or what's the plan?
I would say that the work that I've been doing over the last 3 years in terms of building relationships in the regenerative ag space is really the foundation of all of this. One of the most wonderful thought leaders in regenerative ag is an agronomist named John Kempf. And he likes to say that regeneration is the restoration of relationships. And that is the relationship among the microbial life in the soil. That's the relationship between the stewards of the land and the soil itself. That's the relationship with ourselves. It's the relationship with the environment around us. So for me, the foundation of all of this is building relationships. And that's actually one of the reasons I chose to do this as opposed to doing another consumer-facing business, which is not relationship-based, it's transactionally based. And to get the word out, I'm just looking at those areas where I can build relationships, whether that's in-person events or writing on LinkedIn or taking calls, or like that's really the lens that I'm looking at this through.
Wow, Patrick, amazing interview. I've learned so much. I want to thank you for everything that you've shared today. I hope that you'll come back because I can tell that in the next year that you're going to do some amazing stuff, and I want to hear all about it. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Joanna. It's so good talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Associations Thrive. We're so glad to have you here. You know, my personal mission and the mission of my company, Matrix Group International, is to help associations and nonprofits increase membership, generate revenue, and thrive in the digital space. I want to hear stories of how your organization is thriving in today's challenging landscape. Please apply to be on my show by going to podcast.matrixgroup.net. By the way, do you need help with a digital initiative? Maybe it's a website redesign, a new membership database, or a hybrid meeting that you're planning. I'd love to connect with you. Please visit the Matrix Group website at matrixgroup.net. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode of Associations Thrive. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating, post a comment, and share it with your colleagues and friends. Bye!